Today, we're going to talk about details. So welcome to IP Tech Tuesday 34. And again, before we start, we're going to take a moment for what's happening down south. In an earlier talk, I mentioned the fact that there are a lot of details in a patent application. And how do you organize them? But today, I want to ask a different question, which is where do all these details come from and that they suddenly appear in a patent application? Now, even if the inventor writes a very long and detailed disclosure, the patent application is going to have a lot of details that are not in that disclosure. And most inventors do not write a long and detailed disclosure. And of course, patent attorneys love details. And what I want to do today is try to make the whole idea of where do you get details from and what does these details look like more organized. And, you know, patent attorneys have to be very analytical, but in writing a patent, and especially in having the details, what you really need is imagination, the ability to hold a vision. And we're going to talk about that all the time. What I did was I made several different types of details, and I'm going to talk about each detail, why it is and why we would want to use it. So some details are required for legal reasons. Some are required to support the invention. Some help you explore the invention. Some details are used to help you with the examination process. Some details are for future proofing. You know, patent application is written today, but the patent will last for 20 years. Some details are put in specifically for strategies. Some details are put in to have effects on others, and we talked about that in an earlier talk as well. And when we talk about details, usually we mean technical details, but it's not only technical detail, it's also details how to use things, and it's also potential benefits and adverse effects and side effects. Of course, when you write a patent, there are no adverse effects, but you have to have the detail, because if you have some sort of negative, then probably there's going to be an alternative, and the alternative will, guess what, need more details. In order to ground us, I'm going to use my beloved example of a chocolate frog. And the outside is made of chocolate. And inside you have some sort of energy storage mechanism which can make it hop. And of course it's edible. And I'm not going to give you the technical details now. You can do them at home. And it's, you know, kind of small. But let's just imagine that this is a patent application we want to write, and the question we're asking is, what details do we need to provide? At the end, I'll ask perhaps where we get them from. I call this a central dilemma of patents. Why? On the one hand, we give out ideas. Anybody reading a patent application can extract useful and interesting ideas out of it. But you only get protection for some of the implementations that you describe in the patent, not all of them. But even to get those some, it means you want to describe lots of variations. And if you want to describe lots of variations, you have to have lots of details. And on the most basic level, more features, fewer features, other uses, and you need even more details because you probably don't appreciate the idea that you're publishing. So having given this introduction, let's talk about basic legal requirements. So there's a minimum amount of details that is required in order to meet legal standards. And these requirements apply to all of the details that you add for whatever reason. And more than that, most details you have in a patent application should be either claimable or provide support for claims. So we'll see perhaps other examples later. Having said that, first requirement is clarity. It should be clear what you're saying. Clarity usually requires details. And I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to state that in general, I'm against formal definitions being used to solve the clarity issue. Enablement. You're required to provide enablement of the full scope of the claims, whatever that is, and you have to describe enough in order to avoid undue experimentation by somebody trying to follow what you're doing. That's details. So if I have a chocolate frog and my claim just said chocolate frog with edible mechanism, that covers a lot of different possibilities, and I have to have details for all of these different possibilities. And if I talk about a spring mechanism made out of a glassy state of sugar, then I probably need to describe the details of what sugar and what the exact mixture of sugars I have in there. Otherwise, it will require undue experimentations to do that. Best mode, putting aside the question of whether you're required to give best mode in the US now that you're less likely to lose in court because of it. It requires details. What chocolate did I use? Written description requirement. Okay, the written description requirement is separate from the enablement requirement. If you want to claim something, it has to be described. Those of you who do biology, you can have a lot of details hidden in that written description requirement. I mentioned enablement of the full scope of the claims. That means that a good way of doing it is make sure that you support and define all of the claim limitations that you have. But guess what? It generates more details. Why? You're going to have repetitions because you want to, if you have a claim saying feature A together with feature B, you want to spec to say feature A together with feature B. Those of us who've had the pleasure of arguing with European examiners about support for multiple dependencies know what I mean. At the same time, in the US, not wanting to be left out, they have something fun called species election. In species election, the examiner tries to argue that any feature, usually, not always, any feature that is not explicitly described with respect to the figure that you elected cannot be added to a claim. And there's other reasons to have repetitions as well. The word invention, and I'm not going to define it, but usually it's some sort of collection of abstractions, generalizations, and details. Some details you might not think about is that in some countries you might be expected to explicitly or at least implicitly describe the problem you're solving and make clear what the solution is. Sometimes you have to give benefits. If you don't give benefits, you might be told that it's a mere engineering selection, and anybody reading the application would see that you didn't consider there was a difference between option A and option B. So not only do you describe the details, you also explain why these details are relevant. You need to have utility. Whatever it is that you're trying to claim needs to have utility. It also needs to actually exist, and it also needs to work. Guess what? We solve that using details. We give proof that it helps, that it works, that it can be used. Sometimes we don't give details of an actual proof, an experiment. Instead, we give details to show plausibility in those countries where it helps, like perhaps China or Europe. If you want to show that your invention has a broad scope, you want to show more alternatives. They help show that you deserve a broader interpretation of your terms. In Europe, you have to think about intermediate generalizations. Everywhere, you have to think about claims you didn't put in yet because, claims cost money, but you might want to put them in later. Okay, so invention support, not surprisingly, requires a lot of details. But even if we supported the invention, we still have lots more details to go for. Exploring is something I talked about in the past, but a lot of the work of exploring is done by the patent attorney as he writes the application. And for that, you need scaffolding, different things that you write that help you do the exploration. And here's a few things. One, I'm calling it embodiment parameterization, where you say, well, this feature can be A, B, or C, and that feature can be D, E, or F, and that feature can be X, Y, and Z, and we can do all the combinations. Or, very common in pharmaceutical patents, you have a whole list of diseases that you might be treating, a whole list of modes that might be used. Shopping lists are not good, because shopping lists at most say, I had it. They don't show that it's different. They don't show panability. Therefore, if you have a shopping list, you have to provide details. You have to talk about benefits. You have to say how things are different. So making the shopping list will be the scaffolding, but it's going to force you to add more details. The ecosystem. So we talked about chocolate frogs. Chocolate has a problem of being affected by heat and humidity. So perhaps chocolate frogs need to be packaged in a packaging that's different from just regular chocolate. We'd like to protect that. So our exploration will lead us to that, and the way it will lead us is by us describing the ecosystem in which the chocolate frogs are embedded. Details. To give you an example, I talked about chocolate frog interacting with packaging, but we also have interaction within the invention. Remember, chocolate frog has an outside made out of chocolate and an inside an edible mechanism. Let's assume the mechanism is made out of sugar. How do you attach chocolate to sugar? That's an important detail. Okay, so the different components of the invention interact with each other, and we describe them. And as we describe, perhaps we understand the invention better. Another thing we need, if you write a two-part claim, so you're tempted to think that you should be putting your energy into the post-characterizing part of the claim because that's where the invention is. But actually, the invention is anywhere where the novel thing interacts with old things. So this exploring requires detail to talk about how each part of the invention interacts not only with other parts of the invention, but also with other parts of the product and so on. We have a practice of writing an overview of the invention where we explore the invention. And here we explicitly extract concepts from, the invention and develop it. Of course, when you develop each one of them, they develop in a separate direction and generate more details. I started off by saying that writing a patent application requires vision. So if we look only at vision, consequences, and shortcomings, if you have a vision of what the invention look like, and you can envision what consequences will happen once the invention is used, or what your competitors will do. And you can also identify where the shortcomings are, and where the shortcomings are, people will have to make new inventions and add stuff. Well, all of these, of course, will require more details. One of the ways we do it is providing an end-to-end flowchart and a story of the device. So if you describe the entire story of the device from the minute the kid wants to have a birthday party and the mother decides that there would be chocolate frogs until the end of the party when people take home the chocolate frogs that weren't stepped on. So if you describe this entire flowchart, yes, it's a lot of details, but it also helps you identify what is the best place to ask for protection. And one of the ways we do that, besides end-to-end flowcharts, is considering the context. In this case, let's consider the competitors. Competitors are not making chocolate frogs. Okay, they're making little chocolate dinosaurs without any moving parts. Can we write a patent and they compete with us for the market of party favors at birthdays? So can we write a patent based on our invention which would block the competitor from making stupid chocolate dinosaurs and competing with us? One more tool is multimodal analysis. We don't just look at the invention from one perspective, we look at multiple perspectives. There's a user, maybe more than one, the device itself, and so on. And last but not least is the whole issue of opportunities. One of the interesting types of consequences is the generation of new opportunities where something can be used. For example, if we start making mechanically active toys, there's a whole field of active edible toys that might come into existence. Do we want to protect it? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but it's definitely an opportunity. Okay, forget about all of that. Let's talk about the examination process. Some of the details we put in the application have to do with the examining process itself. I hope a lot of you agree that if the examiner believes that you have a useful invention, the examiner is more likely to give you a patent, or at the very least make useful suggestions. But why should the examiner believe that? You're just showing him a picture of a chocolate frog. One of the things you do is you have a story. I don't mean in the sense of a boy gets up in the morning and wants a chocolate frog, but a story of the invention, a narrative. Guess what? Details. And these details, of course, have nothing to do per se with what you're going to claim. When you do examinations, there's a question, who is a person of ordinary skill in the art? You have to make sure that you have all of the details that that person of ordinary skill in the art will need. Otherwise, the examiner might say, you didn't describe everything you need to describe. It also means that you should avoid using jargon and magic words. Doesn't matter if everybody knows what they mean. But if you avoid using jargon, you have to add details to explain what you mean when you say smooth surface. What is a smooth surface when we talk about chocolate? Okay, it could be that Nestle knows exactly what it means, but regular people need a better definition. Broadest reasonable interpretation, or perhaps broadest unreasonable interpretation, but at least the examiner is allowed to give you a broadest reasonable interpretation. So when we draft the application, we prepare details specifically in order to fight undesired interpretations. And there's really two types of problems. Problem number one is I didn't mean that. The examiner says that when I wrote chocolate frog, frog means anything. Because, you know, we use frog to describe green garbage cans. So if anybody spilled chocolate on a green garbage can and it was made out of compostable material, maybe it reads on our claim. I don't want to go there. So I add details which I'll use in order to prevent the examiner from interpreting what I said in a way that's unreasonable. For example, I talk about the size. There's another type of broadest reasonable interpretation where the examiner is right. The claim said chocolate amphibian, and maybe somebody made a chocolate salamander, that when you put it in water, the tail wiggles and it moves. We didn't mean that, but the way we wrote the claim covers it. So we need to put in ahead of time details, which if the examiner gives an interpretation which is broader than what we want, but is still reasonable, we can define better what it is that we wanted. Of course, examination requires fallbacks. We have to have lots of fallback positions. And all of these fallback positions need details. I mentioned before, you need to have justifications. Otherwise, the examiner is often not partial to selecting an item out of a list and saying that it's panable. Field narrowing details. I talked about an edible mechanism. That is very broad language. What I really meant is that it tastes good. It's not just edible, but it also tastes good. So I need to make sure that I have details which allow me to narrow the field in case the examiner brings in art which is absolutely correct, but it comes from a different field. It just says, you know, it's edible. Now, I had an examiner once who said that endoscopes were edible. So I amended the claim to say swallow. So he said, yeah, you can cut up the endoscope and eat it and swallow it. And here's a link to a website of people who cut up bicycles and swallows them. So, you know, it's the same thing. So definitely a field narrowing detail to explain that I was talking about an autonomous pill would have been useful. And we had it, of course. If you're going to examine, you're going to want to help the examiner understand what you're doing. So you want to have quotes that you can easily quote. You want to have figures that you can point the examiner at, which illustrate something that you might need to talk to the examiner about during examination or during interviews. Again, details. Different examination units have different unusual beliefs or preferences or complaints. And the more you know, the more details you're going to add in order to overcome these things. And I didn't list here, but different countries interpret different words differently. The words comprising and plurality come to mind. Plurality in Russia means something slightly different than what you would expect, and comprising in Australia, not quite sure what it means. Obviously, your patent is part of a strategy. And if you wrote a claim in order to have an effect, the details you added support that strategy. So in general, a patent has a job to be done, and it also has a task to be done. The task is how that patent will help do the job. So obviously this affects how you draft and what effect you want to have, and so on. But sometimes details are themselves part of the strategy. For example, if you want to have a defensive publication, and I'm giving my definition here, I want to file a patent in order to prevent other people from getting a patent. I have to make sure I have the details which will prevent them from doing that. I want to prevent my competitor from capping, which I've talked about before, which is when they file a patent for eating a chocolate frog. Okay, I just described the chocolate frog, but they filed a patent on eating a chocolate frog. And the best way to eat a chocolate frog is head first. And my competitor got a patent on it. And now I can show advertisements on YouTube showing how to eat a chocolate frog. So I should have described it in my patent application as a defensive publication, even if I never planned on claiming it. At the same time, there's detail hacking claims. I didn't write all the details. I didn't write if it's 1 layer of chocolate or 3 layers of chocolate. Yes, it's 3 layers of chocolate. My competitor is aware of that and he writes a patent on 3 layers of chocolate. I have to make sure I have details sufficient to prevent them from getting a patent to block me. Same time, I might want to be an offensive publication. I might want to publish things which will interfere with my competitor's business, like their trade secrets. I didn't steal the trade secret. I'm just guessing what the trade secret is. So I'm happy to publish it. Deceptive details. Why should people know that I'm making chocolate frogs if when they read my patent, they think I'm making chocolate lizards? And last but not least, details to win against defensive publications. If somebody else made a defensive publication, but they didn't put in all the details, I can put in all the details. And then maybe I will still be able to get a patent to block them, just exactly the opposite of what I described before, but I need to make sure that I have enough details in my patent application. Spoken before about psychological effects that you want a patent to have, and some of the details you have in a patent application are in order to give a desired psychological effect. First of all, patents are used for marketing. Sometimes they sell themselves. People should see my patent and say, gee, we want to buy it. Sometimes they market the owner. They show that the owner, wow, I got to talk to that guy who knows how to make chocolate frogs. Or the patent can suggest that I have more stuff that isn't described, which will entice you to contact me and not contact my competitor. Patents help with selling. Okay, I mentioned before the quotable quotes. Same way, if you're going to be in litigation, you want to be able to say figure 2, they're doing figure 2. If you have investors, you want them to see what they want to see. If you have a partner who wants to partner with you, a nice drawing of what the partner is doing would be nice. Patents need to persuade, they need to scare people. Scaring requires details. Attracting people requires details. So when I say details, it's also figures and it's also a story. And here for the first time, I'm going to suggest that maybe more details is not the best. Because if you want to have a story and you have a particular audience in mind, it could be that having details suitable for a different audience will detract. So if you know who your audience is, you can probably do a better job of choosing the details. If not, we do it for everybody. Future-proofing. Okay, we're writing the patent today, and it's supposed to last for 20 years. Here's all the things that might change, and should be clear by now that any things that might change, we want to describe possibilities, and that requires more details. So it can be what the client's going to do, what the buyer's going to do, what do we think is going to happen in the market, competitors, the current state of the art. I'm filing the patent. I already have 18 months blind, which I don't know what happened because other patents didn't publish. And in any case, even if it did publish, I might not be aware of it. because searches, are not perfect. So I need to put in details into the patent application, both for what I call gotcha prior art. Ha, here's somebody doing exactly what you're doing. And for other types of unknown prior art. It's quite common when you write a patent application to be able to say, I don't know if people did it, but they might have done such and such. People are more likely to have made pralines in the shape of frogs than mechanical moving sugar mechanisms that are inside a piece of chocolate. So I should expect more art about the shape of the frog than about the inside, and I should add more details about that. And of course, the law is going to change, and all the happy people who wrote about computer readable media in their patent before the law changed in the US and know what I'm talking about. As the law changes, and sometimes you know what direction it might change, you write more in your patent application to prepare for that. And of course, there's all sorts of assumptions that might be wrong, and the biggest assumption, which is probably wrong, is how the invention works and how the invention must be used. So you have to assume that's going to change, and you have to describe alternatives and details. I've shown you this rose scope before, and the reason I'm showing it now is because I'm trying to help you organize what type of details you need, and I'm focusing on 3 types of details beyond what's shown here. One is, the client is trying to make a change in the world. Maybe the client will succeed, where it says here preferable, want to happen, should happen. Well, we want them to happen because we're going to make them happen. We should definitely file more details over here. We should definitely file more details where the client has extra value. Over here, there's a scenario where the product has more value. We should add more details because we're going to need them. And where bad things can happen, especially IP vulnerabilities, we also want to file more details. Now, there's no way you can know what's going to happen, but luckily for us, patents don't have to describe a complete solution, but instead, if you can describe a scenario, hopefully you can describe some component of that scenario that we know how to do and we can give enough details about. And we do it all the time, so I know it's possible. Some of you are probably asking, okay, so how many details should I put in? And the more details you put in, the more details you want to put in. And if we use tools like I've talked about in the past that help you organize your patent applications, they also help you explore. And when you explore, you naturally find new details to add. I've mentioned before Gene Vinokur, and he suggests 2 levels down relative to the claims. Okay, so claim talks about something, you should have 1 or 2 levels of detail beyond the actual language of the claim. But what about laterally, when we talk about alternatives? I like 3. How about how far into the ecosystem should we go? I don't know. But here are a few things that I use to help me decide when to stop, besides urgent email and phone call from the filing department. So one of them is, if we have a vision of what the invention is, details that are part of that vision go in and not less likely. Second, we want to make sure that the application itself is coherent. And there's definitely a desire, not only on the side of the patent attorney, to have multiple applications. So details which detract from the coherence might be left out. You stop looking. Details that the client needs, that give him value, or as I said before, can help in times of need, are probably more important. In general, we can ask, this detail, does it provide value? Yes, no. What risk does it provide? Okay, and there's risk and there's costs. Risk can be you take away the plausibility of the invention, you make the application less readable to an examiner, as the details will interfere with the later filing. I can go on. In addition, there's a cost. When you want to add a detail, somebody has to generate that detail. Maybe an engineer has to sit down and think, okay, that costs money and distracts the engineer. Maybe you need to do lab experiments. And whatever you write is going to publish. Maybe you don't want these details to publish. So I made a 2x2, which doesn't tell you yes, no, but perhaps it tells you what's more important and what is less important. So any detail we know that's new and it's directly relevant to the invention should be inside, because that's what the spec is for. Anything that is known to be old and is only indirectly relevant, that's a low priority. But you need to think about these ripple effects, because they can change that. And there's intermediate possibilities. In any case, if you're capable, you can multiply this A, B, C, D by the potential value of what you write. So we know that something is old and it's not relevant to the invention, but if we're wrong, we just gave up a lot. So maybe we should put that detail inside anyways. And I'm not going to talk about what to claim, because obviously we're way more limited in claims than in description. Some of you must have been wondering where these details come from. Like chocolate frogs, maybe they come out of a magical factory. So the most important thing is client buy-in, because only the client can know if the detail you're putting in is actually good. But some actually come from the attorney. And my recommendation is, I gave you lots of categories. You can sell them to the client. Asking a client a question doesn't create an inventorship issue. Some details, of course, are what I would call automatic. Once we said A and B, you describe A with B, A without B, and so on. The difference between the attorney and the client is that the client can judge if the detail has enablement, and the client can judge the value. What the client can't do is judge how well you covered what needs to be covered and whether there are alternatives that could bite them. And your job as an attorney is to help highlight that and suggest that more details on particular design might be interesting. In any case, there's a trade-off between how many details you have and what the patent does. And sometimes detail is too expensive, so you limit what you want the patent to do in order not to incur the cost of generating that detail. Summary. You always need to ask what's going to happen, what's going to change, what do I need the details for, what is this patent supposed to be doing, and what details that if I don't put them in, other people will figure them out and use them against me or not. Details cost money, so you have to look for cheaper details, and some of them can actually cause damage to the company. Now, just to give you an example of what this process looks like, client calls you up, and it's kind of like what happened to me this morning, and he says, here's my invention, computer vision powered laser-based weed whacker for home gardens. That's it. That's the disclosure I'm giving you. If you need anything else, send me questions. Okay? Typical situation. First of all, I want you to know that there's a similar product called Laser Weeder for farms, and they also filed an application if you're interested in looking at. And here's, as a mental exercise, how we deal with it. You try to prepare an outline for the application, and for each one of the categories of details we had below, suggest 8 details that would be nice to have. And in order to complete the picture, list 8 specific details that the application or the pattern would have to deal with, and how will providing details help us deal with that. Just as an example, computer vision powered, do we need to describe using machine learning type computer vision or only algorithmic computer vision? What about some other type? I don't know. Any case, that's all the details for now.